Okay, no, we're...
More than enough.
Okay, so now moving to item 16, Plan Change 7, Managing Significant Indigenous Vegetation. Is there any comments from staff on this report as we move into it?
Thank you. So this report seeks public notification of Plan Change 7 to the District Plan. So Plan Change 7 is a targeted and responsive plan change that seeks to better protect and maintain areas of significant Indigenous vegetation while still providing for clearance where it's small scale and low impact, and in doing so it will better give effect to the Canterbury Regional Policy Statement and the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement. And there are 4 key suites of amendments. So firstly, amendments to the definition of improved pasture to establish a clearer bottom line for determining whether an area of pasture is improved or not, and those amendments apply district-wide. Secondly, amendments to Appendix 9166, which is an appendix in the district plan that lists Indigenous vegetation present on Banks Peninsula and includes thresholds of size and scale which represent a point at which the Indigenous vegetation is likely to be significant. Those amendments also apply district-wide. The introduction of a rule framework which seeks to provide for the clearance of Indigenous vegetation within areas of improved pasture below the limits specified on Appendix 9166 and requiring consent above those limits, and that new rule framework applies only in the coastal environment. And also amendments to existing policies to clarify the circumstances when assessments of significance should be provided as part of an application for resource consent to undertake clearance, and to clarify how adverse effects in the coastal and non-coastal areas should be managed. And I'll just finish by saying that as the plan change includes rules that protect areas of significant Indigenous vegetation, they will have immediate legal effect on notification.
Thank you. So we'll move to questions, and I've got one just to kick off. So does this prevent the issue that we saw happen at Kaitariti? And does it meet the aspirations of what Forest and Bird were wanting to achieve in their response to what happened there?
Yeah, so 2 parts to that question. I'll start by saying that if this rule framework that we're proposing was in place when what occurred at Kaitariti happened, then it would have prevented what happened. Accompanying that, though, is Section 10 of the Resource Management Act, which is existing use rights. So existing use rights will still continue to prevail over this plan change. But if you took existing use rights out of the equation and put this rule framework in place in 2018, then yes, what happened at Kaitariti Split wouldn't have been able to occur. In terms of the feedback that Forest and Bird have given us, it's summarised in the Section 32 report, but they did want us to go further and farther than we're going in this plan change, but we did meet with them a couple of months ago to discuss their aspirations and what the plan change was seeking to achieve, and their position was that they would always seek council to go further than what we were proposing. But
yeah, and given that we're going out for consultation, we may well hear some of what we're discussing now in that consultation feedback.
Yeah.
Indeed. All right. Moving to questions. So, Mike, Yanni, Mike.
Thank you. Sorry, I was trying to find what I was going to ask, but I can't quite find it. I read somewhere that they're looking to actually gazette a policy statement very shortly, but there was concern if we didn't actually start doing this now, there may be some issues, and so therefore we'd just go ahead instead of waiting.
Yeah.
And then in here, obviously, it talks about 2 possible pathways to do the RMA, which is obviously the standard or the streamlined. Standard obviously takes a lot longer. Is there not any possibility, I guess, waiting for it to be gazetted, making sure everything's actually lined up with what we're trying to achieve, and then do the streamlined pathway and probably finishing it at the same time than you would have done if we'd just done standard now?
Yeah, the key reasons for proceeding with the plan change now is that there's a risk of court proceedings being reinitiated in terms of declaration proceedings, and there's very little overlap in terms of its proposed content and the National Policy Statement for Indigenous Biodiversity. So the key area where there's overlap is the definition of improved pasture, but I'm fairly confident that we would get submissions on it when it's publicly notified anyway, which means that if it is gazetted in July, then we can align the content then.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yanni.
Thank you for this, and sorry, this question's just been driven off the LTP
submissions that we just had recently, so I wasn't able to put this in earlier. But I'm just really interested in what this means for the Pauaho Heathcote River as a site of ecological significance. Is this going to have any improvement in the way that land use planning around that is looked at?
So that's, from memory from discussions we've had in the past, already a Schedule A site in the plan, is that correct? Yeah. So in the event that any clearance was proposed that would trigger a resource consent, then the changes to the policy framework would strengthen its protection, yes.
So does that, like, how far back is the setback from the river? Because rereading, like, the Kenaway Farm decision, where all the ecological advice was that we needed a 50-metre setback, and the commissioner granted a 30-metre, but reading that advice, there were some really clear observations about things like sea level rise and coastal erosion, and the impact on the ecology. So is there being any kind of consideration given to, like, sea level rise, climate change, coastal erosion, and what that means for some of these sites?
No, we haven't. Well, I haven't looked at it in the context of this plan change. This is very much just about clearance occurring, requiring consent.
And it's also worth noting, paragraph 3.1, that this refers to areas outside the identified sites of ecological significance. So this is
Largely,
not relating to the SESs, this is outside of the SESs.
That is correct,
that
but
true?
given that we're making changes to policies as well, where resource consent would be required under the existing rules that we're not touching, then that policy framework would apply.
Yeah, so I guess the question is, if submitters felt, and we've had them in the LTP, if submitters to this process were concerned that we weren't doing enough to protect things like the Pauaho Heathcote, could they make submissions around the policy changes? And would that be considered in scope?
They can make submissions on the policies that we're proposing to amend, but the scope of the concerns you've described are potentially not within the scope of this plan change and would need to be considered at a future date. So if there's concern about the width of the site of ecological significance identified across the Pauaho River, then that would need to be considered as part of a future plan change on reviewing sites of ecological significance.
But sorry, just to excuse my ignorance, how far does the site of ecological significance go in terms of geographic from the...
It's generally the river and its riparian margins, but it will vary according to the context. I'm unable to... It's not a fixed distance from the river per se.
But referring to the answer to the previous question, it's not relevant for what we're considering today because it's relating to the site of ecological significance, and this doesn't relate to the sites of ecological significance.
That's right.
Thank you.
Changes the policies that apply to sites of ecological significance.
Yeah, it does, and sorry, I should clarify, those policies really only do relate to sites outside already identified ones.
All right. Are there any further questions on the matter that's in front of us today? All right. So I'm happy to move the recommendation in front of us. Pauline will second. Is there any debate? All those in favour say aye. Aye. Against? That's carried. Now moving to item 17, the draft submission on the Ministry of Transport's discussion document